How do I set up a more secure domain controller using Windows Server Core? I think we should find out. A Windows domain controller is at the heart of any organization running Windows infrastructure. There's a few key concepts to understand when setting up a domain controller. An organization's domain is like its digital place of business. The domain controller is like the CEO of the business, making sure it's running as expected. Active Directory is a logical grouping of the business's digital assets, like users and computers, and is also its security guard, controlling access to the domain and its assets. A forest is the wider digital workplace for the organization, like international offices where employees in one domain can access assets and services in other domains. Having a setup like this allows system admins to manage, secure, and monitor the organization's digital place of business from a central system. The only problem with this is that it becomes a target for hackers, who would be able to control almost all parts of the digital organization if they gain control. How can we protect against this? Using Windows Server Core instead of the desktop experience version of Windows Server lowers the security risk significantly, uses less computing resources, and is recommended by Microsoft. Server Core has been around for 10 years, yet most organizations around the world still haven't moved their domain controllers to Server Core. In this episode, I'll show you how easy it is to set up. For those of you who have an aversion to the command line, don't fear, because after a few commands, we'll be back to the graphical user interface you all know and love. So what's the plan, you may ask? Well, I'll set up the basic core server using the sconfig command line utility and set up the server as a domain controller in a new forest and domain, which includes Active Directory and DNS. I'll connect a Windows 10 PC to the domain and install the remote server administration tools so that I can manage the domain controller remotely. This is another key security point. Where possible, no one should be logging into a server directly or using RDP to perform everyday tasks. I will then be able to manage the server using the normal graphical tools like AD users and groups. I like to present real-world solutions on this channel, and in a real organization, if the domain controller went down because of a hardware fault, for example, users wouldn't be able to log in, and in the case of a complete failure, the domain controller would have to be built from scratch, including all user and computer data. Imagine the impact to the business and the usual headless chickens running all over the place. To mitigate this, there should be another domain controller set up so if one goes down, the other is there to save the day. Microsoft does a good job of this through fast replication between domain controllers in the domain and the use of DNS to seamlessly allow users to get to any DC in the domain. So at the end, I'll set up another domain controller, turn the first one off, and test to see if I can still log into my Windows 10 PC. First things first, I've created a bootable USB drive with Windows Server Core 2019. I'll set it up like any other Windows Server installation, except I'll pick the option without desktop experience, which some admins may feel should be named Here Be Dragons. Part of the installation is to set up the admin password, and once finished, I'll simply get a command prompt. From here, I used sconfig to configure the computer name, my admin account, enable remote management, install all Windows updates, and set up a static IP address. Also note that I've set up DNS to point to this server, since it will be the DNS server. I'll exit sconfig, change to PowerShell, and install the Active Directory Domain Services role using Install Windows feature. Now I install a new forest, domain, and the DNS service using install add-ds forest. This password will be needed for any restores on the domain, so keep it safe. Once installed, the server will reboot and sit on applying settings for what seems like forever. Be patient, let it do what it needs to do. To check out our handiwork, I verified the domain controller details. I can also check the domain, And finally, that the DNS server is running. Okay, so the domain controller is all set up. Let's connect from a Windows 10 PC. Ideally, server admins should manage servers from their workstations without logging into the server directly or using RDP. Remote Server Administration Tools, or RSAT, can be installed from Settings, Apps, and Optional Features, and are designed to access only those services or features that you need to configure or monitor on the server. I'll need the AD, DNS, and Server Manager tools. To use these tools, I'll need to join this computer to the domain. Before I do that, I need to set up DNS to point to the domain controller. The whole domain controller and Active Directory setup relies heavily on DNS, so this is an important step. Usually these settings are pushed via the DHCP server, but for this lab I haven't set one up. Now I'm ready to join the domain, and I'll do that in PowerShell. After a reboot, I log into the domain successfully with my account because a domain account was created for me automatically as part of the AD install process, since I had a local administrator account on the server already. In Server Manager, I can add the server core domain controller to manage it using the standard graphical tools like Active Directory users and groups. So I've set up another domain controller in Server Core, named it DC02, given it an IP address, and set up the DNS to include DC02 as the backup DNS server. I'm going to now add it to the domain so that we can manage it using Server Manager on my Windows 10 workstation. Here I've added DC02 to Server Manager and installed Active Directory, Domain Services and DNS to DC02. I've also set it up to replicate from DC01 in the Setup wizard. Let's check how the replication works by creating a new user account on DC01. After a few seconds, the account also exists on DC02. The last thing to do is take down DC01 and test it to see if DC02 takes over. Before I do that, I need to add a DNS entry for DC02 here. I've now powered off DC01, and as you can see, Server Manager can't connect to it. Now if I try to log in with the new user account, we can see that it's logging in fine. And the reason is that it's now going to the Active Directory installed on DC02. So as long as there's more than one domain controller in your environment, your users will always be able to log in. So that's how you install a domain controller in Server Core and make sure that your environment is safe and secure. I hope you've learned something here and apply it to your work environment or your home lab. That's it for this episode. If you're new here at STech Systems, the IT Skills Library is a collection of questions and answers to build your IT skills one answer at a time. Subscribe now and start building your skills today.